Welcome to The Debate. Imagine walking into a hospital where, like, the x-ray technician, the pharmacist, and the surgeon literally never speak to each other,
Sounds like a massive malpractice suit waiting to happen.
right? But they each do their job perfectly according to their own, isolated metrics. The x-ray is perfectly clear, the pills are counted with absolute precision, and the surgical incision is flawless.
They just check their respective boxes.
Exactly. They check their boxes and they report green metrics across the board to the hospital board. But the patient's overall health, curiously, that remains completely outside anyone's direct accountability.
Yeah, because, well, you might have these pristine, isolated procedures, but the patient could still be deteriorating from a completely preventable systemic issue. I mean, the pharmacist doesn't know what the surgeon found.
Precisely.
The surgeon isn't looking at the x-ray properly. Everyone is optimizing their highly specific function, but the ultimate integrated outcome, which is, a healthy patient, is just failing.
And that fragmented, siloed hospital is the exact architecture of traditional human resources in most modern organizations today.
Yeah, it really is.
So today, we are examining a really provocative framework proposed by Jonathan H. Westover, which argues for the complete dismantling of traditional human resources departments. We're looking at his thesis that HR must fundamentally shift away from a functional, centralized employment administration model, which covers things like hiring, onboarding, compliance.
The usual suspects.
Yeah, right. And instead, move toward distributed people operations focused entirely on actual work quality outcomes.
And the central tension we are exploring today is whether dismantling traditional, siloed HR in favor of a distributed, manager-owned model is the necessary evolution for organizational success, or if it dangerously overestimates managerial capacity while completely discarding essential specialized expertise.
I will argue that traditional HR's functional fragmentation structurally prevents organizations from improving actual work quality, making a distributed, outcome-driven model absolutely essential.
And I will argue that completely dismantling specialized HR functions in favor of distributed manager ownership ignores the severe limitations of managerial bandwidth and, frankly, underestimates the critical protective role of centralized HR expertise.
Okay, so to really understand why this complete dismantling is being proposed in the material, we have to look at the core failure of the employment administration model.
Right. The data on this is wild.
It is. There is a staggering disconnect in how HR views its own performance versus how the rest of the organization actually experiences it. If you look at the recent industry data from SHRM, something like 76% of HR professionals rate their function as good or excellent, but less than half of business leaders agree with that assessment.
It's a massive perception gap, and it's one that anyone who has ever worked in a large corporation can probably validate.
Exactly. And this disconnect occurs precisely because traditional HR measures activity rather than outcomes. Think about talent acquisition, right? They measure time to fill, they celebrate when a seat is filled in 30 days, but they don't own the fact that according to global talent trends, over 40% of new hires don't meet performance expectations in their first year.
Yeah, they just pass the buck.
Exactly. HR operations celebrates closing IT and payroll support tickets quickly, while the actual employees feel like they're navigating a bureaucratic maze. HR has essentially become an administrator of employment activities, not an architect of work quality.
Right.
So the solution proposed in the material is that HR must stop owning these transactional activities. Instead, they should become system designers, focusing entirely on making work clearer, fairer, faster, more productive, and, more accountable.
Look, I acknowledge the dysfunction you're pointing to. The HR service experience gap is very real. That friction employees experience when bouncing from recruiting, then being handed off to compensation, then handed off to operations, it's undeniably frustrating.
It's exhausting for the employee.
It is. But I am deeply skeptical of the proposed solution of distributed ownership. We really have to look at the lived reality of the modern manager here.
Okay, fair.
The data shows that managers already spend 8 to 12 hours every single month on HR-required activities. This is performance documentation, system updates, recruiting tasks. If you're managing a team right now, you know exactly what this feels like.
Yeah, doing paperwork on the weekend.
Exactly.
It's just Sunday evening spent approving time cards and navigating some archaic portal software.
Well, I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on that friction. The functional specialization itself is what inherently degrades the employee experience and creates that Sunday night admin nightmare.
How so?
Let's go back to our hospital analogy. When an employee is navigating a role change, they are treated like a pinball. They bounce to recruiting for internal applications. They bounce to compensation for salary bands. They bounce to learning for transition training.
Right, the pinball effect.
Yeah, and each of those functions applies its own timeline, its own portal, and its own communication style. The employee is the one suffering the fragmentation. Consider what happened at Unilever, which is highlighted in the material. They realized this pinball effect was destroying productivity.
Right, they moved to an experience design model.
Yes, and what experience design means in practice is that you stop treating the employee like a series of isolated HR tickets and you treat them like a single user on a journey. By redesigning around the employee experience rather than functional silos, Unilever eliminated 27 separate HR interactions for new hires.
Wow, 27?
27. Think about the friction of filling out 27 different forms or talking to 27 different specialists. By eliminating that, they reduced the time it takes for a new hire to become fully productive by 30%.
That is significant.
They stopped asking, how do we process these tickets faster, and started asking, how do we design a seamless journey?
Okay, I'll give you the pinball effect. Nobody wants to fill out 27 forms. But eliminating redundant touch points is just good process engineering, right? It doesn't mean you have to fire the specialist or dismantle the department. It just means you need better software and internal communication. And this completely falls apart when you move away from simple onboarding and look at complex issues like employee relations.
Okay, let's look at employee relations.
The material champions the Patagonia model, where employee relations, which handles workplace conflicts, harassment, equity issues, is distributed to department leaders rather than HR specialists. And look, the idea of building a trust architecture sounds incredibly appealing on paper.
Because it works.
But does it? Investigating complex workplace complaints requires genuine legal, investigative, and psychological expertise. Doesn't dismantling specialized employee relations risk missing systemic fairness issues that only a dedicated, centralized function can objectively monitor?
I don't think they're structurally blind, though.
Think about the mechanics of this, though. A department leader might resolve a conflict between two employees quickly, and that feels like a win. But they lack the vantage point to see if that same conflict, maybe rooted in a subtle gender bias or toxic policy, is happening in 5 other departments. Centralized HR connects those dots. Distributed managers are structurally blind to them.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame the Patagonia model a bit differently. It isn't about ignoring legal requirements or blinding the organization to systemic issues.
Then what is it about?
It's about shifting the primary mechanism of employee relations from reactive damage control to proactive trust building. Traditional employee relations is essentially organizational defense.
Sure, risk mitigation.
Right. It waits for a complaint to occur, then it investigates it to mitigate legal risks to the company. But research into high-trust organizations shows that when managers truly own their environment and act with integrity, you see massive spikes in productivity and engagement.
I agree with that in principle, but
You don't build that trust architecture by centralizing conflict resolution in some secretive HR silo. You build it by giving managers transparent decision-making frameworks and holding them directly accountable for the trust levels on their teams. HR still exists in this model, but their job is to act as expert coaches to those leaders, not as the organizational police force.
But coaching only goes so far if the person being coached doesn't have the foundational bandwidth or aptitude for the task. Sure, maybe a manager can be coached to handle a basic interpersonal conflict.
Right.
But what happens when that manager is tasked not just with resolving disputes, but with actively building the capabilities of their team? Because transitioning from employer relations to learning and development, we see the exact same assumption that managers can just absorb highly specialized skills.
Actually, I'm glad you brought up learning and development, because centralized L&D is perhaps the clearest example of functional failure in the modern workplace.
You think so?
Oh, absolutely. The traditional model is completely obsessed with content delivery. We track training hours, we track completion rates on learning management systems, but it almost never translates to actual behavioral capability.
Well, people do need training.
They do, but look at the IBM data cited in the material, it's damning. They found a 30% gap between the skills the business needed and actual employee proficiency, despite those employees completing an average of 60 hours of training annually.
Yeah, 60 hours is a massive investment of time for a 30% shortfall. That's a week and a half of lost productivity per employee.
Exactly. And recent research on training transfer rates, which measures the degree to which a training course actually changes how an employee behaves at their desk, shows us exactly why this fails. The transfer rates are often as low as 10 to 30%.
Just clicking through slides.
Yep. Employees click through the modules, they smile for the satisfaction survey at the end, and they return to their desks entirely unchanged. Capability isn't built by watching a corporate video in a vacuum. It is built in the flow of work, led by the manager who actually understands the context of the employee's daily challenges. This is why Microsoft's shift in 2017 was so vital. They moved away from centralized content delivery toward manager-led coaching and integrating learning into real work.
See, I actually look at that completely differently.
Really?
Yeah, the failure of centralized L&D to produce perfect training transfer is well documented, yes. Clicking through a compliance video doesn't make you a better coder or a better strategist. But challenging the feasibility of manager-led capability building is equally critical here.
How so?
Let's look back at that modern manager we were talking about. Surveys show that nearly 2/3 of managers already rate their organization's performance management systems as ineffective or counterproductive.
Well, yeah, because the systems are bad.
But think about the gravity of that. If the vast majority of managers are currently failing to navigate basic, standardized annual performance reviews, how on earth can we expect them to architect complex, individualized capability building frameworks for their teams?
Because the HR systems are what's breaking them.
Are we not just shifting the failure from an HR department that at least studies learning science directly onto the shoulders of a middle management layer that is already stretched to its absolute limit?
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it assumes the new model simply dumps traditional HR tasks onto managers without changing the underlying system.
Doesn't it?
No. That massive failure rate in performance management exists precisely because traditional HR designed an overly complex, compliance-heavy system that managers hate using. It's a system designed for HR's tracking needs, not the manager's operational needs.
Okay, but
The redesign we are talking about isn't about making managers do HR's old job. It's about fundamentally redefining HR's role. HR shifts from being process owners to expert guides and system designers. They build simple, highly effective frameworks that managers can actually use in the flow of work.
what does that actually look like in practice, though?
Look at DaVita. They didn't just tell their clinic managers, hey, you're in charge of employee learning now. Good luck.
Right.
They provide intensive, ongoing training in what they call people leadership stewardship. They treat a manager's ability to build team capability as being equally important to their technical or clinical skills. The manager is the owner of the outcome, but HR is the architect, supplying the blueprint and the tools.
A blueprint still requires a skilled builder, though. And when you distribute ownership across hundreds of different builders, you invariably introduce variance.
Well, variance is natural.
Sure. But some managers will be exceptional stewards of capability, naturally gifted at coaching. Others will be terrible at it. In a centralized system, you at least establish a floor of standardized development.
A very low floor.
Maybe, but when you distribute it entirely, an employee's career trajectory becomes highly dependent on their specific manager. It becomes a postcode lottery for your career. And that variance brings us to the rules that govern those managerial decisions, organizational policies.
Ah, the policy manuals.
Yes, a builder needs a blueprint, but they also need building codes. What happens to the rules in this distributed model?
Well, the traditional policy manual is another area absolutely ripe for dismantling. Traditional HR prides itself on comprehensive 300-page policy manuals addressing every conceivable situation. But that complexity just creates the illusion of control.
I would argue those policies exist for a reason.
Do they?
Yes, when organizations move to simplified principle-based policies, like Netflix's famous context not control approach, they open the door to immense bias.
I mean, Netflix is pretty successful.
Yes, Netflix's principles sound incredibly liberating on paper. We're a team, not a family. Hard work is irrelevant. Only results matter. But replacing clear, standardized rules with trusting managers to make context-appropriate decisions practically invites selective enforcement. And the research on organizational justice is very clear here. Inconsistent treatment directly undermines the fairness HR ostensibly exists to provide.
But does a massive rulebook actually guarantee consistency? I don't think it does.
It provides a baseline. Think about the psychological impact of inconsistency. When one manager interprets context to mean granting flexible hours to employee they personally get along with, and another manager strictly enforces desk time for an employee they don't, you don't have a trust architecture.
You have favoritism.
Exactly. You create what organizational psychologists call psychological contract violations. That's when the unwritten expectations between an employer and an employee are shattered. It's the visceral pain of seeing your coworker get a perk or a grace period that you were denied simply because their manager interpreted the context differently. You end up with systemic inequity dressed up as empowerment.
I see the risk you're highlighting. I really do. But the empirical evidence suggests the exact opposite mechanism is at play in reality.
Really?
Yeah. Research points out that policy proliferation, adding more and more rules, actually reduces compliance and fairness.
How does more rules equal less fairness?
Because when you have a massive convoluted policy manual, employees don't read it, managers can't interpret it, and it ultimately becomes a tool for selective enforcement anyway. A manager who wants to favor someone can always find a loophole in a 300-page manual to justify a biased decision, and they can use the manual to punish someone they don't like.
Well, that's just bad management.
But it proves that centralized rules are an absolute illusion of control. What Westover's framework proposes isn't anarchy, it's proactive fairness monitoring.
Unpack that. How does proactive fairness monitoring actually stop a biased manager if there are no strict rules?
By looking at the actual outcomes instead of the paper trail. Instead of waiting for an employee to file a grievance to trigger a policy review, HR uses its analytical capability to monitor outcomes across the organization in real time.
Okay, so heavy data analytics.
Exactly. They analyze payroll data, promotion rates, and performance ratings for demographic disparities before complaints ever surface. So if that manager you mentioned is consistently giving flexible hours or higher bonuses only to a certain demographic, the data flags it immediately. You pair this data analysis with transparent decision-making frameworks. Everyone in the company knows the criteria for a promotion, and the outcomes are constantly audited by HR. It's a much more rigorous mathematical protection of fairness than a dusty policy manual that nobody reads.
That sounds great in theory, but have you considered the psychological weight of that transparency on the manager?
What do you mean?
Well, if every single pay and promotion decision is going to be continuously analyzed for demographic disparities by an algorithmic HR oversight function, managers might just default to the safest, most homogeneous decisions possible to avoid flagging the system.
You think they'd play it safe?
Absolutely. If I know an algorithm is watching my promotion rates, I might not take a chance on an unconventional candidate. Furthermore, relying on proactive fairness monitoring assumes the organization has pristine data architecture and the analytical maturity to interpret that data without introducing new biases.
Well, tech companies do it.
Sure, but for many mid-size organizations, that dusty policy manual is literally the only thing standing between an employee and a manager's unchecked subjective bias. You mentioned the illusion of control earlier, but data dashboards can also create a dangerous illusion of objectivity.
Look, that's a fair challenge regarding data maturity. Not every company has the analytics engine of a tech giant, but we cannot let the pursuit of perfection anchor us to a system that we know is actively failing.
Is it failing that badly, though?
Yes. When surveys look at tens of thousands of employees, HR systems consistently rank among the lowest in workplace satisfaction. Why? Because they feel like bureaucratic obstacles serving HR's compliance needs, not the employee's actual work needs.
I can't argue with the satisfaction scores.
If we maintain the employment administration model, we are choosing to protect a system that tracks activity metrics perfectly while the actual day-to-day work experience degrades, and the organizational consequences are severe. When high-performing talent perceives a lack of growth or feels stifled by bureaucracy, their likelihood of leaving skyrockets. We are losing great people because we are forcing them to navigate a labyrinth just to get their jobs done.
I agree that the consequences of maintaining the status quo are severe. The Sunday night admin burden alone is a retention killer. But the danger of the distributed model is that it assumes middle managers have infinite elasticity.
They don't, but
We are asking them to be talent acquisition specialists, learning architects, conflict mediators, and objective arbiters of compensation, all while delivering on their actual high-pressure business metrics. It's like asking them to run a marathon while carrying a filing cabinet.
that's a great visual.
Right? The material cites examples where companies eliminated HR business partners entirely and trained leaders in people leadership stewardship, which is inspiring, but it is also an extraordinary cultural outlier. Scaling that level of managerial enlightenment across an average organization without the protective net of specialized HR is incredibly risky.
It is absolutely a heavy lift. It requires treating leadership development as a massive core investment, not just a weekend seminar you send managers to once a year. But that's exactly why HR needs to be fundamentally redesigned, not just optimized around the edges.
Right.
Let me pull these threads together from my side. The employment administration model is an industrial-era relic. As long as HR is measured by activity completion, like training hours logged, requisitions filled, or IT tickets closed, it will remain a well-intentioned but fundamentally bureaucratic obstacle.
Mm-hmm.
The only sustainable path forward is transforming HR into a capability-building engine. Managers must own the work quality outcomes, and HR must evolve to design the systems, the transparent frameworks, and the data insights that support those managers. Work quality, not process compliance, is what drives actual business results.
And, to summarize my perspective, an obsessive focus on activity metrics is clearly a flawed way to run a business. We completely agree there.
Definitely.
But completely dismantling specialized HR functions is a dangerous overcorrection. Line managers, no matter how well-intentioned or how intensively trained, simply cannot absorb the full complex weight of talent acquisition, intricate employee relations, and compliance. By pushing these highly specialized functions onto a distributed network of generalist managers, organizations risk severe inconsistencies in fairness, equity, and employee well-being. Centralized expertise isn't just bureaucracy. In many cases, it is the protective structure that ensures a just and functional workplace.
I think where we fundamentally converge today is on the vital need for a metric revolution. HR absolutely must shift its focus toward measuring meaningful outcomes, like organizational clarity, systemic fairness, and how quickly an employee reaches full productivity, rather than simply tallying administrative throughput.
Agreed. Measuring outcomes is non-negotiable at this point. The tension remains entirely on how we achieve those outcomes without either overwhelming our managers with new responsibilities or sacrificing the critical expertise that protects the workforce from systemic failure.
Exactly. It is a profound balancing act between centralized expertise and distributed ownership. There's so much more depth to this framework in the source material for those looking to explore how to practically architect these changes within their own organizations.
Absolutely.
But it leaves us with a lingering question, bringing us right back to that fragmented hospital we started with. If we finally tear down the walls between the X-ray tech, the pharmacist, and the surgeon so they can actually work together, so they can actually collaborate, who is ultimately equipped to take responsibility for the patient's life? We'll leave that for you to decide.